Let's move on. Let's talk about the impeachment trial against Donald Trump. It's getting underway yesterday in Washington, D.C. The president is accused of breaking the law by pressuring the leader of Ukraine, the president there, Zelensky, to dig up damaging information on a political rival, Joe Biden. He says he's done nothing wrong. Let's speak now to Marc. He's Director of Strategic Communications for the Trump 2020 campaign. He's in Washington, D.C., the White House there behind him. Mr. Lauter, can there be any doubt now that Mr. Trump pressured a foreign power to dig up dirt on a political rival? Can there be any doubt about that now?
There is absolutely complete doubt. It actually didn't happen. And if you look at the transcript of that phone call that the president released, he talked about investigating corruption. He also never linked military aid. You had President Zelensky, also the foreign minister of Ukraine, say they felt no pressure. They didn't know there was a hold on that military aid. And then the aid was released and there were no investigations ever announced. So this entire case has fallen apart, and none of the basic facts of that case have changed since day one.
Let's go straight to the basic facts. Where in that famous call of July the 25th to the Ukrainian president does Mr. Trump mention Ukrainian corruption or even use the word corruption?
Well, he's talking about the corrupt practices that allowed the son of the former and then sitting vice president of the United States to be paid tens of thousands of dollars a month with no experience in that industry, not even speaking the language. But then you also have issues where it has been documented by a former a reporter who now works for the New York Times, that Ukraine also meddled in the 2016 election, wanted to make sure that President Zelensky, who ran on a platform of rooting out corruption in the Ukraine, was actually going to follow through on those promises.
Right, but the president in that call does not talk about Ukrainian corruption in general. Indeed, he doesn't even use the word corruption. What he's most concerned about, other than the CrowdStrike server, but above all, is Mr. Biden and his son being in a Ukrainian energy company. That's what he asks for an investigation into, not an investigation into Ukrainian corruption in general. He was asking for dirt to be dug on the man that he most fears as a presidential opponent. That's beyond doubt.
I completely disagree with that characterization.
Well,
let's not forget that this is the then sitting vice president of the United States who was in charge of Ukraine policy while his son was being paid on the side by a corrupt Ukrainian country. That falls very much at the heart of corruption in Ukraine. And it wasn't about a 2020 election. You're talking about activities by the actual sitting vice president of the United States at the time. And I think it's absolutely appropriate that we make sure that the foreign policy of the United States of America was not being corrupted by the then vice president, whose son was getting a very nice side deal under the table.
Let's just get the facts right. 30 minutes before that famous call, a top aide of Mr. Trump texted a top aide of the Ukrainian president to say, what the president wants you to do is investigate the Bidens. That's what he said. He prepared them for the call. Then after the call, when a statement was issued, the statement was changed by Mr. Trump's people to add the Bidens in. That's where the investigation had to be. And that's why he was holding up the military aid. It was all part of pressure to get Zelensky to do his dirty work.
I absolutely disagree. In fact, every witness who has testified in this, and there is only one witness who actually has any firsthand knowledge of the president's call with President Zelensky, said that the president said there is no quid pro quo.
Well,
and you have multiple people.
Ambassador Sondland says, and he's the president's man, he's a political appointment, he's the ambassador to the EU. Was there a quid pro quo, he says? As I testified recently, the answer is yes. That's the president's man.
And it's also speculation and his own opinion on those things, because the only person who actually had direct contact with the president of the United States said there was no quid pro quo, and that was a quote from the president. Everything else is just conjecture, speculation, third and fourth hand accounts. It's like schoolgirls gossiping at a cafeteria table.
Well, except that facts do matter. I appreciate perhaps in America not as much as they used to. But if the military aid, almost $400 million to an ally that was facing military threats from Russia, if that wasn't held up to bring pressure on the Ukrainians to dig the dirt on Biden, why was it withheld?
Well, as the president has said many times, he wanted to make sure that our European allies were also doing more to support Ukraine. He also wanted to make sure that the money that was being spent was not being wasted. Ukraine has a history of corruption, was long known as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. The president was absolutely right to make sure that our aid was not being wasted, and also using it as leverage to make sure that our European allies stepped up, did more to support Ukraine, that it wasn't just falling on the U.S.
He never
taxpayer.
told the European allies he was withholding the aid. How could he use it as leverage when the Europeans didn't know?
There are many times when the president has asked our European allies to step up, do more. This is just one more example of that.
But you said he was using this aid as leverage. You can't use something as leverage if the people you're trying to lever don't know.
Well, as I said, the president has said that he wanted our European allies to do more.
I understand,
He's
but
making
that's not
the
what I'm
case that they
asking you.
need to do more.
And if it was because of corruption, or he wanted the European allies to do more, why several months later did he then release the funds when nothing had changed? There had been no investigation into Ukrainian corruption. There had been no changes in the way Ukraine operates, but he then released the money. Why?
Well, as the president said, and there was growing calls and questions from Congress. There were continued discussions going on with the Ukrainians, and when the president then did release the aid, it was able to be used there, and that's consistent with U.S. foreign policy.
What had changed from him withholding the aid in the middle of July to releasing it in the middle of September?
Well, I work for the president's campaign. I don't work in the White House, so I can't speak to what was going on behind the scenes in the White House. But I can tell you that as what has been publicly reported is that there were a number of senators who were also engaged in this effort. You also had additional work being done by our State Department, by our allies, and the president released the aid before the deadline of Congress that was imposed.
Of course, the president only released the aid when it became public that he had withheld it. When the whistleblower and all the stories that came out with regard to that. If it's clear that it wasn't to pressure the Ukrainians in to investigate Mr. Biden, why, when Republican senators asked the OMB office in the White House or the Pentagon or the State Department, why is the aid being withheld? No reason could be given. They got no reason. We've just seen the emails were published yesterday. No reason was given. It wasn't said it's because of corruption, wasn't said because we're pressing. It was held because the president was using this for his own purpose. That's clear, isn't it?
No, the president sets the foreign policy of the United States of America. It is not set by the State Department. It's not set by the Pentagon. The president withheld that aid. He wanted to be sure that Ukraine was going to follow through on its plan to root out corruption. And when the president made the decision to release the aid,
he never gave that as a reason.
The president makes those decisions. He ultimately decided to release that aid, and it's not necessarily falls to the Senate or to staff members or to bureaucrats in the government. It's the president who sets the foreign policy, and he did so.
If you are going to withdraw aid from an ally that is under threat, 400 million pounds of military equipment the Ukrainians said they badly need, don't you have a duty to explain why you've done that?
Well, the president he has released the aid. The aid was not withheld. It was released before the deadline.
I'm
the president was making sure
the aid was withheld, and then when it became public it had been withheld, it was suddenly released, and the whole thing smells, doesn't it? It's clear what was going on for anybody with eyes to see.
What is clear is what's going on was that you had a Ukrainian government that was corrupt, has a history of corruption. You had a new president who was elected with no political experience, who was trying to root out that corruption. And it is the responsibility of the president of the United States to make sure that American taxpayer dollars are not being wasted or thrown into a corrupt system, which has a history of corruption.
All right. Marc Lotter, we'll leave it there, but thank you for joining us. I know it's early in Washington, D.C. I hope you come back as this process unfolds and we can talk about it again. Marc Lotta there, Director of Strategic Communications for the President.